What's up, guys? This is Mr. Eldridge, and in today's video, we are going to look at the resurgence of the conservative movement in American politics. Richard Nixon is one of the most controversial United States presidents to ever hold the office. He was largely a right-wing conservative who was responsible for the developments and legislation that both sides of the political spectrum would deem positive, and yet was involved in select scandals that both sides jointly condemned. Nixon was sternly anti-communist and pro-American, but he had a realistic approach to politics in that he realized one must cater to both sides in order to ensure a more cooperative Congress and a happy constituency. Nixon was not necessarily an opponent of all social and cultural changes of the 1960s and 70s, but he had a keen attempt to win the South. We often know this as the Southern strategy. By attacking encroachment of federal government on individual life, Nixon credited this with the silent majority in 1968. The silent majority was a term that he used in the 1960s and early 70s to describe a large but quiet group of people that have become increasingly frustrated with the rapid social and cultural changes implemented during the 1960s and 1970s. He often cited the hasty subjugation of the states to the federal government when implanting civil rights laws. He often saw movements like the sexual revolution and the hippie movement as immoral practices. Nixon's political strategy worked as many conservatives, especially in the South, wanted to limit the role of the federal government and oppose the pace and authority at which the federal government swept over local and state authorities when implementing liberal policies on civil and individual rights. Such developments are most clearly seen in the suburbs of the Sun Belt region. This is an area that had become an electoral college powerhouse in the mid to late 20th century. On the other hand, Nixon is also largely responsible for the formation of the Environmental Protection Agency, also known as the EPA, which is a federal department approved by Congress that researches, assesses, and informs the government and public on environmental issues. While some may argue the efficacy of certain reforms, this organization has contributed significantly to the development of many governmental regulations and protections over the past 40 plus years. Now, when we also talk about Nixon, we have to talk about his scandals. While there was much success, his behind-the-scene actions began to unravel in the 1970s. Nixon most famously had what is called the Watergate scandal that began in 1972, in which he arranged for the wiretapping of members of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate Hotel. Not only were the wiretappers caught, but a money trail led to investigations by journalists and later the FBI, and all of these began to lead back to Richard Nixon and the Oval Office. He also initially used the FBI, the CIA, the IRS as weapons against opponents who tried to uncover additional information or challenge him. When investigated by the Congress for Watergate, he was instructed to hand over the tapes and recordings of his many White House calls. These recordings were withheld by Nixon, who cited executive privilege. This is a constitutional right of the executive office to withhold certain information in the interest of national security. When the Supreme Court made a final decision to force Nixon to hand over the tapes in the United States versus Richard Nixon, he erased select portions of the tapes. This was a clear obstruction of justice. When impeachment and conviction seemed imminent, Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974. But he was pardoned by Vice President Gerald Ford roughly about a month later. The scandal forever damaged the reputation of Nixon and the office of the presidency. The scandal, coupled with the controversial claims of executive privilege, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and the bombing of Cambodia, all called into question the increased power of the presidency and the abuses of power in the Oval Office. Also along the same lines of this resurgence of the conservative wing of politics, you also see a landmark Supreme Court decision in Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade is a landmark Supreme Court decision in 1973 by the Supreme Court on the constitutionality of laws that criminalize or restricted access to abortions. The court ruled in a 7-2 decision that a right to privacy under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment extended to a woman's decision to have an abortion, but that this right must be balanced against the state's interest in regulating abortions, protecting women's health, and protecting the potential of human life. Arguing that these state interests became stronger over the course of a pregnancy, the court resolved this balancing test by tying state regulation of abortion to the third trimester of a pregnancy. The case became a hotly contested topic between liberals and conservatives, with liberals arguing that abortion rights are an extension of women's rights, i.e. pro-choice, and conservatives arguing that abortion was a violation of one's right to life, i.e. pro-life. The decision in Roe versus Wade, along with other cultural changes of programs that were part of the civil rights movement, the Great Society, etc., helped to stoke a reactionary surge by the conservative right wing of American politics. Since the beginnings of imperialism across the world in the 19th century, the West had systematically exploited the governments of colonies and independent nations alike. While Western imperial grip had begun to wane due to domestic and international opposition, instances of economic imperialism continued well into the late 20th and early 21st century. Economic imperialism is when Western states or businesses financially and or militaristically support a regime in exchange for their economic compliance, i.e. allowing Western businesses to operate at a low cost or with access to the best land and resources. One such instance was in the Middle East. Islamic states, particularly those with Arab majorities, were promised self-determination following World War I by the British for their efforts against the Ottoman Turks. Instead, the Arab states were administered by European governments according to the League of Nations mandate system. This, along with the formation of the State of Israel and its support by the West, resulted in the mostly Arab nations of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, also known as OPEC, enacting an oil embargo in 1973, which wrought havoc in Western economies. While Iran was populated by Farsi-speaking people of mostly Persian identity, the anti-Western sentiment was the same. The ruler, the Shah of Iran, was considered a puppet of Western economic imperialism. As such, in 1979, led by a theological movement, the Iranian Revolution, aka the Islamic Revolution, removed the Shah. To replace the Shah, the movement instituted a theocracy based upon Sharia law. Tensions between the West and Iran quickly boiled over when shortly after the revolution, Iranians illegally overran and occupied the United States Embassy in Tehran. Iranian forces captured and held 52 Americans for 444 days. While the president at the time, Jimmy Carter, moved to their release, hostages would be held until the election of Ronald Reagan in 1981. The internationally covered event damaged the reputation and prestige of the United States. As a poor, small nation, Iran was able to hold Americans hostage against the will of the world's most powerful nation. Thank you so much for paying attention to this video. If you have not subscribed to this channel, please go ahead and do so now. Thank you so much, and have a great day.